promise with you. Don't tell me that they are gone to never look into those eyes again. The sun might just as well not rise again. Oh, no, 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 it can't be right. It must have been something I dreamed last night.
Mick?
But there's your empty chair and there's your glass untouched. A shadow in the air was all my fingers clutched. Oh no, it wasn't a dream. It's horribly terrible.
The name of the star.
My soul and my body scream. How can I live without you? To go through life forever missing you. To know that someone else is
Okay, I'd like to call
kissing
tonight's
you.
City of Santa Barbara Harbor Commission meeting to order. Jeanette, would you call roll, please?
Yes, Bill Spicer,
Here?
Jim Sloan,
Here.
Corey Vantolin, Betsy Kramer, and Dennis Power, and, Helene Webb. Dennis Power, Stephen McIntosh, and
I think that's it.
will not be present today.
Very good.
Okay.
Technically, tonight is a special meeting of the Board of Harbor Commissioners, and I see that it's special because Mr. Treiberg is manning the helm for the Waterfront Department. Are there any changes to the agenda?
No changes this evening.
This is the time where we open for public comment. It appears we don't have any public comment tonight, so I will close public comment and we'll move to our first item. Jeanette, would you read the recommendation? Oh, well, that's what the first item is, actually.
Item 1, approval of the minutes. Recommendation that Harbor Commission waive further reading and approve the minutes from the regular meeting of August 21st, 2014.
Moved. Second.
Call for a vote. All in favor of the recommendation?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any nays? Motion passes. Thank you. Now we will move on to our regular and our director's report.
Good evening, Chair Spicer and Commissioners. This last month, our City Council adopted an ordinance amending our lease with the Conway Vineyards Incorporated, allocating the annual base rent of $51,624 seasonally to allow for lower base rent during the slower winter months and a higher base rent during the busier summer months. The next semi-annual advisory board chair and vice chair meeting will be hosted by the Waterfront Department and is scheduled for Monday, September 29th from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. at the Munger Theater in the Maritime Museum. This is an opportunity for the various chairs and co-chairs to hear updates on current issues and projects that the advisory boards and commissioners are working on. Tentative items for the October meeting. The first item is our 6-year capital improvement plan. We're probably going to have a budget subcommittee meeting a couple weeks prior to that, likely the first beginning of the week of October 6th for those of you on that budget subcommittee. Adam Hendel from Public Works will be here to present the Cabrillo Boulevard Bridge Replacement Project. The contract was recently awarded to Lash Construction, and that project's going to get underway very quickly, and that'll have some impact on the waterfront area, especially Stearns Wharf. As far as the local coastal program update is concerned, it's likely that that's going to be postponed until November. The Coastal Commission lost some staff, so the review of the chapters that have been prepared by city planning has been delayed a little bit. So it's probable that'll be a November item. One thing to make note of this evening is due to vacation schedules, we plan on postponing the October meeting for 1 week until October 23rd. This concludes my report this evening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Triberg?
I just have a quick one. Sure. And it's as much for you as anybody else. So for that, the advisory board chair meeting, do we need to prepare anything? Or?
Let's ask Commissioner Kramer, who's attended these in the past.
What was the question?
On this semi-annual advisory board chair and vice chair committee meetings, the one that's next Monday, do we need to prepare anything for that?
What you should do is have a list of stuff that's happened since you last were there, which for you weren't there since the last meeting, actually, to say what the Harbor Commission's been doing, and be prepared for any questions, and there probably won't be any questions. So if you just, say, we've granted such and such leases, we've done such and such things, and whatever you think that the rest of them might be interested in knowing.
Okay.
Very good.
So maybe we can work on that.
And
Yeah.
they serve food.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Carl. We'll move on to the business services report. Mr. Bossy?
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Two quick items for this month's Business Services Report. The first is in August, this past August, the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum added a new entrance to their Maritime Museum store. And this new door is up here on the screen for you. It was put in by Burkus Construction. They did it over a few days. It's all wood. It's a wonderful improvement to the area, and it will also hopefully enliven that whole foyer. It's as you approach the building and enter, it's off to the left. So instead of having to go around the corner near the public restrooms to enter the store, you can now enter it rather easily right off the foyer. I should also note that this took the place of the historic bulletin board that was there, and it has been there for many years. And so that historic bulletin board was also moved over towards the elevators, and our staff has been responsible for putting this in, actually Carl's staff, and they've done a wonderful job. It's not quite done yet, but this will be a nice place to put up announcements and things like that. It also took the place of the old roll-up doors that had a tendency to acquire pamphlets and other advertising material that kind of looked a little messy. So this will clean up the area, and two good new additions, in a sense, to the downstairs of that building. And that concludes my business services report. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Was there anything on the
yes.
fish market?
I forgot. I got so engrossed in my photos. The Santa Barbara Fish Market, we've been kind of keeping you apprised of their progress on moving their warehousing facilities outside the harbor. It's a good thing. They were growing, and they continue to grow, and this will allow them to keep growing. They moved into an 8,000 square foot parcel over on Quarantina and Bond Street. It's a little bit below the Santa Barbara Junior High School. It's a 3,000 square foot building, and it also has about a 5,000 square foot parking lot. They've done a number of improvements, including a whole new parking lot, new asphalt, and the interior has an enormous amount of space for refrigeration. They've got cutting-edge technology, and we're hoping that they'll continue to see themselves grow. But it's a nice move for them, and it's a nice move for the overall harbor as well. One of the things they would like to do possibly in the future, once they get that up and running and a couple years down the line, is looking to their current facility in the harbor and improving it and making it more of simply a store, more of a store feel, comfortable store like you see in other harbors down south in San Diego and things like that, and really upgrade it and make it a lot more convenient. They will have more space to sell, which is good. So it's a win-win for everybody, and we're happy they're move their facilities and continue to expand, and we look forward to future improvements down in the harbor. And that concludes my report.
Very good. Any questions for Brian? Thank you. I had one quick question. Are they the same tenant that share space behind the waterfront offices? And are they going to continue to keep that space?
They are the same tenant that shares space. I believe it's 132B, right behind us at the waterfront. Their current plan is to continue to have that office space. I believe their lease is up in 2016. And for the current time, I think they've got a lot going on. So we have been in touch with them if that was their plan, and it is. The new facility that they're in, again, is primarily warehouse space. There's not a whole lot of office space there. Definitely not enough to accommodate the current staff that they have.
Very good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Moving on to Mr. Croman and Harbor Operations.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. This evening I have a few items to present to you. I wanted to start with one that you may have read about in the newspapers already. And in mid-August, an individual who was a commercial fisherman in Santa Barbara for a long time, Mr. John Wilson, was convicted on 4 felony counts of grand theft and a bunch of misdemeanor counts related to activities associated with illegally removing shellfish from other individuals' receivers. His arrest and ultimate conviction followed several months of investigation by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We weren't involved, so I wanted to make that clear. But all that being said, Mr. Wilson agreed to a pretty severe term. Formal sentencing isn't until October, but he agreed to 3 years felony probation and 6 months in the county jail. So if there's any indication how seriously the courts and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the state, if you will, take crimes against marine resources, this should serve as a cautionary tale. Quoting District Attorney Kevin Weichbrod, he said this case demonstrates Santa Barbara County's dedication to our fishing community and to those fishermen who do their utmost to abide by all the laws and regulations in the course of their profession and help protect our local resources. So Mr. Wilson currently has a 60-foot slip on our finger, and given the severity of the crime, given the severity of the circumstances, he has been issued a 30-day notice of slip permit termination that was issued on September 12th. The permit will be terminated effective October 12th, after which Mr. Wilson has the ability, per the municipal code, to appeal that termination. First, if he so chooses, seeking a waiver from the waterfront director, and if he should fail in that effort, to come before you as a commission. I thought it was fair and appropriate to let you know that tonight, because the question would inevitably come up anyway, and it also lets you know how seriously we take this matter, sort of mirroring what the courts have done. And so in mid-August, we also had an interesting fisheries event out in front of the harbor. We had people were calling us left and right, wondering, what are all those bright lights in front of the harbor? Well, it was a squid run. We had a lot of squid, a few hundred tons actually, taken over like a 5-day period between Carpinteria and Ledbetter, and 2 nights in a row, they were right dead out in front of the harbor in shallow water. And people asked us a lot of questions, so I thought I'd advance a couple of answers to you. This is not unusual for squid to spawn in shallow water and be taken by purse seiners like these. These are from Ventura, I believe, and a lot of the ones fishing up here were from Ventura. They work on a 118,000-ton quota a year. Now, that sounds like a lot of squid, but considering the amount of biomass they work on, it's actually a highly sustainable and highly regulated fishery. In fact, what's interesting is that that quota is an annual quota. In the last 2 years, they've met their quota well before the year was up. And they seem to be on a pace to do that again insofar as at the end of August, they'd taken 68% of the quota through 42% of the seasons, which starts April 1st. So that's what that was all about. It was kind of cool to see them out there. They have kind of some of the lights have a green glow to them, but there were a lot of calls and a lot of Ed Hat comments and what have you. Dispatch was getting calls. We were getting calls, and so there was a lot of explaining to do, and I hope that helps explain what that was all about. We also had a big swell in the middle of August, a little toward the end of August, another big Wednesday, if you will, for those of us who are old enough to remember the movie and the event from many, many years ago. A hurricane-generated south swell hit our area with waves as high as 15 feet in some locations. And Santa Barbara, and around Santa Barbara Harbor, the waves were big, mighty big, but they weren't on the order of anything that would do an enormous amount of damage. In fact, the only damage that was done locally for us was one boat was sort of bounced its anchor up onto the shore and ended up on East Beach. There was no wind. It was just a lot of swell, and it actually lifted the boat's anchor and bounced it up on the beach. Thankfully, its owner took care of that, and the boat was removed within 24 hours, so the waterfront department, other than facilitating communications, didn't really have to get involved. And the other was one of our dive skips that the maintenance crew uses for working on and under Stearns Wharf, was torn loose from its tether on the east side of Stearns Wharf, and we lost a toolbox out of that. But other than that, the boat has been rehabilitated and restored and is working well again. So the only real loss to that was the toolbox. But I do have a few pictures to show you. Wouldn't be the same if we didn't have photos of the South Swell. And so, hold on. Thank you. Sorry about that. Here are your South Swell photos. This is coming in right towards West Beach. We usually don't see that very often. It was a heck of a swell, and it took a lot for Harbor Patrol to even get out through this swell. And this is Harbor Patrol. Now, when I first saw this photo, I thought, oh, my goodness gracious, and I thought the waves were breaking toward the boat. But then I was advised by my smarter colleagues, look closely, Mick, that's the coastline in the background. And they're really actually looking at the backside of the swells, but you can still tell how huge they were. And this boat did need to be rescued. A wave actually broke over this boat, and we got to it between sets and put it on a stiff rope, as they say, and towed it into the harbor. So we're very lucky. There was no significant damage from the South Swell, and except for an epic day of surfing at the Sandspit, which if you just go on any website and Google Sandspit August 27th, you'll find it. It was pretty incredible. Also, in our ongoing training at the waterfront, we concentrate oftentimes on environmental response training, and it usually has to do with either clean water protections like storm drain management, this, that, and the other, or oil response. And this year, as we're going to do again next year, we had an oil boom drill where we took boom from a trailer that you've often seen in the launch ramp. And as by way of background, in 2009, the waterfront was granted $23,000 for this trailer and the boom inside of it to guard against the quote-unquote big one. And that was actually a result of an oil spill up in East Bay, up around Oakland, where I believe a freighter hit a bridge up there, and there was quite a spill, and the spill was ultimately contained. But what was really surprising was the damage it did to small local marinas. And the California Harbor Masters Association and other trade associations in the state worked with the Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife's Office of Spill Prevention and Control to work on a grant program where a lot of marinas got this trailer and this boom. And so what we did was, and this boom is actually, the boom that's in the trailer is actually long enough to go across the harbor and close the entire harbor mouth off to protect it against a large event coming from, say, one of the oil rigs or a broken pipe. What we did during this drill is we took the boom out of the trailer, and then you see it being taken. Whoops. You see it being taken out to Boat 3. There it is coming out of the trailer, and here it is being towed out on Patrol Boat 3. And what we did is we just took out enough boom to encircle the equivalent of the largest boat we have in the harbor, and the only standing object we could decide on that would be an equivalent was the bait barge. And so here we are. The boom is being towed around the bait barge. And then this is the boom being retrieved back into the truck and back up into a trailer stall to dry for 24 hours. Overall, it took about an hour to complete the drill. The drill was very successful, and we feel confident that we can respond to a minimal spill, a moderate spill, I should really say, like that. And this coming year, it's very likely we're going to do another oil boom exercise. We may work with the fire department and the Coast Guard and try and do a multi-agency response training to pull the boom all the way across and almost fully across the harbor to demonstrate we have the capacity to do that if necessary. Finally, hopefully it's not a reminder anymore, but I'm going to mention it anyway. On October 11th, that's coming up real soon, Saturday the 11th, we have our 13th annual Harbor and Seafood Festival at the Harbor. Admission is free. I want to repeat that. Admission is free to the festival. It goes from 10 a.m. to 5. We've got it. Everything you enjoyed in years past, we've got it again. It wasn't that broken, so why fix it, right? So we've got fret lobster, crab, oysters, barbecued albacore, paella, sea urchin, on and on and on with the seafood, plus Brophy Brothers clam chowder. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. And there's great music with 3 live bands and nearly 40 arts and crafts vendors, tall ship visits, Coast Guard cutter, dockside tours, touch tanks, and free boat rides, care of both Skip Abed's Double Dolphin and Fred Hirschman's Azure Seas. And one thing I thought I'd mention is that we're this year, starting around noon, we're going to, as a little bit of a change, we're going to be serving a fresh chilled lobster and crab plate combination. So it's complex, a lot of moving parts. So it's one of the ways we're trying to take some pressure off the live crab booth, the live lobster booth, and divert some of that to a prepared plate where those animals will be cooked early in the morning, right when the crabs are cooked, and they'll be put on ice and be ready to be plated around the noon hour. And with that, Mr. Chair, by the way, I would be really remiss if I didn't mention that there are so many other aspects of this festival. I'd be here for a half an hour explaining them. So the easiest thing for folks to do is go to harborfestival.org. That's harborfestival.org. And I believe we link to that from our city website as well. Am I correct? Yes, we do. So you can go to the department's website and link to it there, or just go to harborfestival.org, and that is the dedicated website for our Harbor Festival. It will take place on Saturday, October 11th in the harbor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kronman. Any questions for Mick? Commissioner Kramer?
Yeah, I have a question about the boat that came ashore. You say the East Beach anchorage. What part, and why did it come ashore, and was it able to be saved?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, the south swell, the best we can figure, was so large. It was a ground swell. Lifted the boat. The boat probably didn't have a lot of scope on its anchor, so it actually probably bounced its anchor right up onto the beach.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it came up in the typical spot on East Beach where it was easily accessible by Marburg, and the owner took care of it and had Marburg come down and salvage the boat and take get it off the beach within 48 hours.
So the boat was lost then?
Yes, ma'am. The boat was lost. It was destroyed when it hit the beach, essentially.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any others? Quick question, Mick. When is the Harbor Festival, and what does it cost to attend?
October 11th, free, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I'm sorry I forgot that.
Thank you. Okay, we are on to new business. Jeanette, would you read the recommendation, please?
Yes. Item number 5, Waterfront Department Fiscal Year 2014 Preliminary Budget Review. Recommendation that Harbor Commission receive a staff report providing a brief summary of the Waterfront Department's revenues and expenditures as of June 30th, 2014, and provide comments as appropriate.
Very good. Is that Mr. Bossy? Please.
Good evening again, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. As Jeanette indicated, this is a brief overview of our preliminary budget from last year and how we ended up as of June 30th, 2014. Before I get into the more of the details, I do want to let you know, again, it's preliminary. We don't think there will be significant changes with the numbers we have, but remember also that the city is dealing with a new financial management system, so there could be some hiccups here and there. Also, I want to let you know that big picture, the department did very well. And you're going to see numbers in here that are very good to see. But keep in mind that both in fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013, we had good years as well. A big part of that was the weather. We had amazing years for both of those years. So when we were preparing the budget for fiscal year 2014, we thought 3 years in a row, there's just no way we can have great weather for a third year. Well, it just so happens that we did. So fiscal year 2014 was again a good year. And when we were doing that budgeting from 2013 to 2014, we notched it back about 5%. So the discrepancy is significant in a good way. But I just want to let you know that when we were budgeting, we took 2014 and knocked it down 5% roughly. And so these figures are above that 5% reduction. So here we go. Again, overall, as I said, revenue was great. As you can see, our property management was up almost 16%. Our financial management, 3.4%. And down the line, parking services significantly up at 22.5%. And overall, we were about 11.76% above what we budgeted. And I'll get into each of these programs individually, and we can go through some detail. As far as property management is concerned, that was an 8.24% increase, a little over $400,000. And here's how your major components are broken down. Our wharf commercial was up $17,000, or about 6.5%. Our wharf food service was up $46,000, and that's about a 3.4% jump. And you'll see it's a significant difference from what our harbor food service was. Harbor commercial was up $54,000, and as I was just stating, our harbor food service was up $205,000, which is a 20% increase in harbor food service. So I think a big part of that, again, weather, as it is also on the wharf, but also I think the OTA on the alley continues to do amazing business. As far as cruise ship revenues, that was up totaled $432,000. That's a 200% increase, and it's a bit deceiving. The reason why it's so much, we didn't shove a bunch of new ships in there. What happened is in the spring of the previous year, it's kind of hard to get our checks on time or in a timely fashion from the various cruise ships. They're big organizations. They're all over the world, but we have worked that out. So what happened was a lot of those cruise ships that were in the spring then rolled over into the fiscal year 14. So in the spring of 13, it took us till about August or September to get those payments. So they went into the fiscal year 14. So that's why you see basically a doubling of our revenue. So we've worked with them. We've got it on a 30-day process now. So they're going to be paying in a more timely manner. So we'll be more on track with our budget. As far as our financial management, that is our interest income, and that's taken care of by our finance department. It totaled $142,000 this past fiscal year, which is down $8,300 or 5.51%. So not exactly what we'd like to see, but what the industry as a whole is seeing. And I know we've had the discussion about our investments in the past, and we've had finance here to give you a whole lot of detail on what we can and can't do with that money. Parking services, again, a great year, 18.89% above budget, and that's $440,000. As you can see here, all of our lots, these are all above what we're budgeted. $35,000 at Cabrillo East. Stearns Wharf was up $16,000. Harbor Main lot was up $85,000. The only revenue that we saw decrease was at Ledbetter. Why that is, I have no idea. Thankfully, it was a small increase, and we had huge increases at the other parking lots. I'm not quite sure of why we're seeing that small decrease. It could be that there were even more SBCC students in the past year. Not quite sure. But again, parking services, I think a big part of that was our Luke systems that the commission approved some time back, and we're finally getting full fiscal years of data as far as that's concerned. But I think that's really helped. As far as marina management, up slightly, about 2.5%. Our slip transfer fees were up $9,600. Our slip rentals were up $82,000. And our visitor fees had a nice jump of about 8.5% or $35,000. Again, very much weather dependent, great weather, calm seas for a good part of the year, and people just keep coming, and we're happy to have them. Total revenue versus 2013. You can see that we were about $1.4 million over our budgeted revenues, or about 11.7%, as I said at the start, and about nearing $1 million more than fiscal year 13. Again, we did take that baseline of 13 and dropped it 5%, not anticipating another great weather year for the waterfront. As far as expenditures are concerned, here's kind of a big overall breakdown. Big number in the bottom right, I should say, is the total. We're about 5, almost 6% below our budgeted expenditures. And that basically every particular category was down, some more than others. And I can get into a little bit of detail. Again, $808,000 under budgeted expenditures. Our salaries and benefits for the 4th consecutive year were below our budget target. So we spent less in salaries and benefits. One of those reasons, albeit a small one, but as we get down, everybody was pretty much below their budgeted expenditures. My time is still paid 25% by what was the redevelopment agency, so that's been a cost savings, and we're happy to charge that over there. And then we've had new employees come in at a lower step, whereas the older employees who have retired or moved on were at their highest step. So that's why we see a significant decrease there, or part of the reason, I should say. Our supplies and services came in at $2.8 million. I should say $2.5 million. Our budget target was $2.8 million, so that's about $208,000 below our target. So we continue to what looks like ration our supplies and services, but we do have pencils and paper, so we're good. Our debt service. This came in under budget as well, about $293,000, almost $294,000. The primary reason, and this is kind of one of those things I tell you every year because it's always below, is that it's a bit, the state's billing system is behind. And so we will owe this money, so it's not, we can't go out and spend it. Their billing process for the fiscal year is a little bit different than ours. So we'll get that bill in the coming months, and if we haven't already got it now, so that money will be absorbed. Our total expenditures, again, $12.75 million through June 30th, 2014. Our target was a little over $13.5 million, and that's a almost 6% reduction in our expenditures overall. Big picture, just taking our revenues and expenditures into account, we come out with about $1,158,000, and our idea with that, instead of using it as a surplus, is to plug it into the capital program, primarily for future years of the Marina One project. And I know Mr. Riedman and Carl have talked about this in the past. The idea is, with our loans that we've been approved for, we can pull down on that money. But if we have enough in our reserve, in the end, we might be able to pay for a phase or two. Of course, that's a number of years out, but it's a nice way to plan for that future and set that money aside for that purpose if it's available at that particular time. But that is something we'll get into with the Budget Committee in the coming month. We can talk about that kind of stuff. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions? Commissioner Webb.
Thank you for your report, Brian. I was wondering what accounted for the slip rentals increase. Is that slip fees or occupancy?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Webb, the slip rentals are those folks coming in. So the slip fees you're going to see pretty much standard. Let me see if I can get here for you. Sorry. There we go. Our slip rentals are our slip fees. So those went up 82%, which is equivalent to that 2% increase that they received that year. I think it's 2.04% actually. So that's what that $82,000. That's just that 2% increase that was tacked onto those. So we still have a full harbor. Everybody's still there. The visitor fees are exactly that. People coming from out of town. And boy, we fill up all the time, which is great. People are coming up to visit. They enjoy being here. And we provide good services for them. So that's what the visitor fees are. Mm-hmm.
Questions? Commissioner Sloan?
Yeah, I just wanted to compliment you guys on a great job of managing the finances for the waterfront department. I know that revenues are kind of hard to predict, and the weather's hard to predict, but expenses is something that you can control. So great job on that. Really, really good to see. Thanks.
Commissioner Bantlin?
I just wanted to echo that and also comment on the financial management because I always harp on that. I think this is the first year that it's been overestimate. So, and that's just because they finally gave us a low number and they realized that they weren't going to really meet expectations, which is okay. And that's really kind of what I complained about. So I wanted to give some kudos there.
My kudos as well. Well done. And I appreciate you pointing out at the beginning that these are preliminary figures. We don't expect it to change too much, but there could be some change. And remind us again, do we know when the Budget Committee is going to meet? Has that been set?
We'd like to meet probably October 6th or 7th. That's the Monday and Tuesday of that week. And Jeanette will reach out to the subcommittee members and see if they're available on those dates.
Very good. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Bossy. Our final item is number 6. Jeanette, would you read that, please?
Yes, item 6, definition of vessel. Recommendation that Harbor Commission A receive a report on draft policy recommendations related to the definition of vessel, and B, conceptually approve proposed definition of vessel, and C, conceptually approve draft policy recommendations related to the definition of vessel.
Very good. Mr. Cronman?
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, as you may recall, we first introduced this issue to you in November of last year, and what we did was we advanced a proposal regarding the definition of vessel. What we wanted, our intention was to take a long-standing effort of the city, in particular the Waterfront Department, to ensure that it complies with and advances the direction and guidelines of the local coastal program and our harbor master plan, which basically state that the harbor priorities for the harbor, it's a working harbor, priorities for which are to serve commercial fishing and recreational vessels. It's never been designed as a harbor for floating homes. In that regard, the city has taken well-intended steps toward that, first with a navigability ordinance many years ago, followed up by an operability ordinance, which we have now. And as a reminder of what we discussed in November, and I followed up with in an article in Docklines, which is attached to your report this evening, the Supreme Court heard a case early last year, one of the rare times that here's a maritime case where they actually, as part of that case, and I won't get into the details of that, defined what they thought, what the majority, the Judge Brennan, speaking for the majority opinion, defined what he thought, what the majority thought a vessel really is. And after consulting with high-level maritime attorneys, we realized this might be the best way to go about this policy-wise, to sort of draw a line in the sand and say no more houseboats in Santa Barbara Harbor, because really, in the spirit of the city fathers, in the spirit of the planning documents with which we operate, that's really where we need to go. So what we did was last year, as you may remember, we came up with a proposal for the definition of vessel, which you see here. Now, there are only 3 words added to what you saw in November of 13, and that is we've added a self-propelled floating craft whose physical characteristics indicate that it was designed and constructed for the purpose of carrying people or goods over water. This is very much mirrors what the Supreme Court said in early 2013. So after our discussion last November, after writing the Docklines article, the next step for us was Harbor Patrol surveyed the entire harbor, every boat in the harbor, and we made we looked at all the photos of every boat out there that might come close to not meeting this definition, and actually we're only able to identify 4. So thankfully those 4 would be the only ones that we would have to grandfather in. You'll see a little bit about that in a moment, because we have no intention of doing any disservice or any harm to the folks who don't currently meet the definition of vessel as proposed moving forward. And again, I think this is probably a good time to mention it. This has absolutely nothing to do with our liveaboard policies. Our liveaboard policies would be unaffected by this. Today, if any slip permittee wishes to walk up into the waterfront office and apply for a liveaboard permit, we have several of them. We are not close to our limit, and they can get one. So this isn't about liveaboards. This is about craft. What kind of craft are appropriate to be berthed in Santa Barbara Harbor? And currently, we only found 4 which is pretty good out of almost 1,300 slips. I'm pretty happy with that. That means pontoon boats like lake boats, they're fine. Keel boats on which people have built, some might argue overbuilt superstructure, are fine as long as they're safely operable, because the operability ordinance isn't going anywhere. So these are the four we found. They are no reason to name the names or who they are or what have you. You can see these are ones that don't have keels necessarily, fairly boxy framed establishments. Some of them quite lovely inside, by the way. I toured several of them, and they are very, very lovely homes, but they are, in fact, floating homes. And here's another one, and this is the one owned by the gentleman who I believe wrote a letter to the commission, Mr. Gale. And then, of course, this is the houseboat that's been prevalent in the harbor for many, many years. And I'll speak more about that in a minute, but I hate to use this as the go-to example. But currently, or before we started these discussions, we would have had a hard time, as long as it could be made operable, which this boat was, right, in the time and day and time when it was permitted in Santa Barbara Harbor. It would be difficult to prevent giving a slip permit to a craft of this type tomorrow if they were, say, to want to be at O-N-tie, right? And so I think you get sort of intuitively, also policy-wise, why we're moving in this direction. So here are the draft policy parameters. What I did was I met with each of the four people, the owners of the four craft you saw in those previous pictures, and to have a discussion about what they thought would be fair, what we think is appropriate as waterfront staff, and what we wanted to do is bring these parameters to you and get your input about these commissioners so that we don't make a mistake moving forward, because what we want to do with your consent and approval tonight is take these parameters and begin my work with the city attorney's office to amend the municipal code to reflect this wording, not only the definition of vessel, but I need to go through Title 17 and put the proper wording in, reflecting, the fact, for example, that all other aspects of the Title 17 would pertain to existing grandfathered floating homes, like overboard discharge and things like that, and only separate out the very few policy elements that would not. So tonight is a policy discussion. Hopefully we'll get your approval to move forward, and the rest of it will be working with the city attorney's office. I would return to you then in the late winter, early spring with those track change suggestions, and together we work through that optimally, and then it would be to ordinance committee and to city council before the end of the fiscal year to codify everything we've been working on since last November. So here are some of the draft policy parameters. There would be no requirement to meet the proposed definition of vessel. That's the point here. Everybody moving forward would have to meet this. These folks would be grandfathered in. They would not have to meet the definition of vessel. They would have the right to conduct a straight transfer, in other words, a transfer by which another party buys the floating home and transfers into the slip. That's a standing policy. It's actually an ordinance that you can do right now, so they wouldn't be denied that privilege either. They would have the right to add slip partners, just like anybody else, for a transfer fee, just like anybody else. They would have the right to swap slips with a similarly sized vessel or grandfathered floating home in Santa Barbara Harbor per the specs outlined in our existing waterfront policies. And basically what that is similar sized vessels can swap, mutually consenting slip permittees can swap boats in their slips. But if the difference between them is over 5 feet, they need to pay the transfer fee per foot on that difference of more than 5 feet. And we don't have a problem with this. The one exception is the houseboat I showed you back here. We have an agreement with him that that's staying where it is. And he's agreed to it. He's very glad that we're moving through these policies the way we are. And so that's the one exception. The other three vessels would have all the rights that we're going over here. They would be not required to prove operability. There would be a waiver of their operability requirements. So there would be no charade. There would be no silly attempt to prove that they're compliant with something that they never were intended to comply with. They, of course, need to, be kept in generally good shape, just like any other vessel. Hopefully they're, don't let them fall apart like any vessel under this definition. But they don't have to drive around the red buoy. They don't have to drive around the bell buoy and prove that they're operable. And by spending $10,000 to hook up a ceremonial functioning operability system with an outboard and cables up to a helm and what have you. They would be grandfathered in. We would recognize them as floating homes. They would be, as they are, not have to meet this requirement. No length or beam modifications to the grandfathered floating homes. In other words, they can't grow longer or wider. They'd have to be grandfathered in as they are now. And as I mentioned, existing liveaboard policies would remain the same. So that's pretty much the long and short of it. I would say, though, after meeting with each of the four individuals, they all told me that they agreed that these were appropriate, that they could live with them. We worked these out together, actually. And I know Mr. Gill wrote you a letter. Tara Folsom was intending to be here tonight. I told her about 7:15 or what have you. She's either late or I know she has a young family, so she may be busy tonight. But I think I can speak with fair confidence that the four individuals who own these floating homes, each of whom I met with, are okay with these policy parameters. And that concludes my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Commissioner Sloan.
Good analysis, Mick, and I appreciate you reaching out to everybody and talking to them. Just on this, I'm wondering why just length and width and not height changes. Can they go up?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sloan, they can go up because any vessel or floating home on the harbor can go up. And once you do that, if you go too high, then you start, and this is an interesting point of discussion because with vessels, if you go too high, then you start getting cross-threaded with the operability ordinance. Because if they go too high, they can't safely operate because they become tilty, if you will. With the floating homes, we hadn't considered that. If the commission wishes to advance that notion, I'd be happy to undertake that and communicate with the owners of the floating homes and see if they would agree. It's the commission's will. If you'd like to advance that as an issue that you feel consensus on, I'd be happy to go back to the folks of the floating homes, and hopefully I could communicate with you via email relative to the outcome of that, and then we could still stick to our plan of coming back with ordinance changes, proposed changes. But I think it's a good point, and it's a valid point.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about it. Obviously, we don't want people just continuing to build up because they do have neighbors and things like that to consider.
Well, that's true, but we have to also be cautionary about being the aesthetic police.
Right.
We can run into a lot of trouble with folks if it's like it's like neighborhoods too.
No, I understand, but
we don't have that
there
zoning.
are safety issues that we have to be concerned about as well. And I notice in here there is no reference to other safety requirements like what the Coast Guard requires or things like that. And I'm a little bit concerned that we're waiving an operability, and are we condoning not having a seaworthy platform? I don't want to call it a vessel because we're defining a vessel here, but a seaworthy platform in our harbor that doesn't meet, other jurisdiction safety requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner Sloan. I will check on that as well. I want to make sure that we're not cross-threaded with the Coast Guard regulations. That's absolutely fair and appropriate question. I'll check on that.
Commissioner Kramer.
Yes. I'll wait till he's finished writing.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Kramer, I didn't hear you.
Finish writing.
I was just taking notes on Commissioner Sloan's comments.
Okay. I was wondering why, thank you for the report first. And thank you also for listening to us in the November meeting and picking up on Frank Kelly's question about the transfer and so forth. Very much appreciated. I was wondering why you didn't take the definition of vessel straight from the Supreme Court thing. They did not. They, for instance, say under and self-propelled, that is not a dispositive description, and it's not necessary as part of it. I mean, I've got the case here if you want, And they have also in there, I can read it actually, that a reasonable observer looking to the home's physical characteristics and activities would not consider it to be designed to any practical degree for carrying people or things on water. The reasonable person standard has problems, of course, but it also, I think, is pretty fair. And I'm just wondering why you chose this particular one.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, very fair and a question. The definition that we ultimately advanced to you tonight was one that we worked out in concert with the city attorney's office. And they were the first ones who suggested we take out any sort of discretionary language like reasonable person and practical degree and what have you. And so what you see here tonight is a lean and mean version of what the city attorney's office recommended to us to advance as the definition as we move down this path.
Why self-propelled?
We added that because we think it's an important element of anything that's a real vessel. And I
the court didn't, excuse me, but the
I'm
court
sorry,
did,
ma'am?
the court did not. The Supreme
Right.
Court did not.
Right. And we added that.
Okay.
Okay? Because we think that self-propelled in this case, for our purposes in our harbor and also reflecting the intent of the local coastal program and the harbor master plan, that adding the word self-propelled underscores the nature of a vessel versus a floating home. Underscores the fact that it's not a barge, it can propel itself, it doesn't need to be towed into place, which a few of the floating homes in our harbor had to be actually towed into their slips. So we thought it was reasonable and fair. We checked with all the individuals who own the floating homes we showed you tonight, and they were all okay with that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Follow up, sir?
Yeah, I just had to comment on that self-propelled. It comes to mind what happened down in Cabo San Lucas 2 weeks ago was they had a hurricane that devastated it. And prior to the hurricane, they only had about a 2-day notice, and they had to move a lot of the boats out of one part of the harbor into another part of the harbor on a very short notice. And so being a self-propelled vessel allowed them to get them out of harm's way. If we, fortunately we're not in a hurricane area, but if we ever had a large storm that required us to move boats, having vessels that can move is a nice thing. So again, it's sticking with the working harbor. It's sticking with a recreation harbor where boats are used and things like that. So it has to be self-propelled. We're not a commercial harbor where we do have barge traffic or anything like that. So I like that part of it personally. Thank you.
Anyone else? I've asked you mentioned that Mr. Gill sent a letter, and I've asked Commissioner Webb to read it into the minutes.
This is from John Gill. Hello, Harbor Commission. Unfortunately, I am not able to attend tonight's meeting, but figure I could weigh in on the topic of definition of a vessel, as I am the owner of one of the 4 vessels that was identified as a floating home. I recently met with Mick Croman and discussed the matter and the policies that are being presented for conceptual approval. In my conversation with Mick, I explained why the Santa Barbara Harbor is so dear to me. We had similar sentiments. I have lived, worked, fished, surfed, and sailed in and out of the harbor for almost 20 years. I know many of the other boat owners, business associates, fishermen, harbor patrol officers, ocean lovers, and wonderful characters that make up our community. It is my home. Yes, I am sure my vessel is not the most conventional looking, but it is safe, well-loved, and serves its purpose superbly. I have complied with all the city's requests for navigability, stability, and have proven its seaworthiness a number of times. I named my boat Ishi when I built it, and it is now seems quite fitting. You might recall the story of the California Yaha Indian, whom was the last of his tribe to survive a raid by early Californian settlers. With approval of the draft policy, there will not be another Ishi. Although this saddens me a bit as an artist and a dreamer, I am sure it is a sigh of relief for the Waterfront Department. I understand their commitment to keeping the harbor a working harbor and not a floating housing project. I don't want that either. It has been difficult for them to enact this commitment without proper legislation. By supporting the drafted policies, it seems I am helping to preserve the place that we all love. I have read through and understand the recommendations and agreed to all 7 listed. I welcome any comments, questions, or feedback. Thank you, John Gill. And I also mirror his sentiments, and I too am one of the people with a floating home, so I would like to disclose that at this point. And thank you for your report and your work on this.
Thank you, Commissioner Webb. And Mick, I also will add my appreciation of the outreach and accommodating the current floating home owners. With that, I believe we have potential recommendations and votes coming up, or motions. We've received the report. I believe the motion would call for an approval of the draft. I would entertain that.
I'll make that motion that we approve, in concept at least, the proposed definition of vessel, and that we approve also the draft policy recommendations related to the definition of vessel.
Second.
I have a...
Mr. Chair, I apologize before you vote. I just want to let you know that when I come back, if you were to approve this, when I come back with proposed municipal code amendments, I will also come back with a report on the 2 issues of height and Coast Guard review. So if you want to add that to motion, you should certainly feel free, but I can assure you when I come back with my next report, I'll address those.
I made the motion. I'm not adding to it. Yeah.
I think that's sufficient. Thanks, Mick.
Very good. At this point, then, we will have a vote. All in favor of the motions put forward, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any abstentions?
I think I should abstain.
Very good. Any nays? Motion passes. Thank you, Mr. Cronman. Any staff commission communication, Mr. Treiberg?
Nothing to report this evening, Mr. Chair.
I had one thing I wanted to touch on since we were talking about floating homes. I understand that there had been some slip permittees that were renting out their boats as Airbnb or as hotels, and I just wondered if you could touch on that briefly.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, as you may recall, several months ago now, I want to say maybe 6 months ago, I reported to you about our efforts to stem the activity where folks rent out their boats to folks for the week or the month, basically botels, if you will. The premise to us was pretty clear that, number one, it's not legal. Subletting as part of the slip permit folks sign is prohibited by the municipal code. And also, this is municipal property rented on a month-to-month basis, so folks paying $300 a month for a slip to rent from the city and charging folks $3,000 a month to rent it through Airbnb seemed legally and philosophically and not in the spirit of good public policy. So we wrote an article in Docklines about that, and I told you that the director had actually waived a slip permit termination that I advanced in that regard. Well, I'm sorry to report that the word hasn't spread down the TomTom network yet. So it's a couple of weeks ago, it was brought to my attention there were 4 more ads on Airbnb, and I contacted all 4 of those individuals who were advertising for quite a lot of money and already had published records for August on how many times they'd rented to folks, probably taking as much in a few weeks as they'd have to pay in slip permit fees for a year. And I contacted them all, and I articulated the consequences for doing that, and they were all off of Airbnb and Craigslist and what have you within 24 hours. Now, that being said, this is really not something, we're interested in chasing our tail on again and again and again. So I hate to say it, but ultimately it's not impossible. We're going to have to draw a line in the sand, and it's not impossible. You'll be sitting here listening to somebody appeal a slip permit termination on this, because when we have over 24 people on a waiting list who really just want access to boating in Santa Barbara Harbor, and we have people renting out their vessels as botels. There's a disconnect there in terms of the advancing sound public policy, and at some point we're just going to have to get tougher on it. It's not something we want to do. We've tried to go by the education route as much as we can through this commission, through dock lines, and now back to the commission, per your question, Mr. Chair. So we'll just see after what the future holds, but it is not the right thing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Croman. I believe Commissioner Kramer wanted to weigh in.
I have a comment, question. Perhaps that should be something that should be brought up at the at another Harbor Commission meeting. Maybe there should be something in the excuse me, in the municipal code or something. I mean, does that this is public property and it can't be leased out or something. This is off the agenda, and I don't think we should probably be discussing it.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Kramer, this could be agendized at one of the commissioners' requests, and I'd suggest you communicate with Mr. Reedman, and he can agendize it if he'd like.
Commissioner Sloan?
I had one question, and maybe this should be put on a future meeting as well, but I noticed, Carl, that signs have gone up about the widening of the end ties in Marina 2 and Marina 3. And I know we've talked about that before, but now since the signs have gone up, maybe you could just give everybody an update on what the timing of all of that is.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sloan, those signs you see are a requirement of the Coastal Commission. So we obtained coastal development permits for that. We're going to start with 4A end tie. I believe I reported it last month as part of our minor capital improvement program. So it's going to be part of that. Hoping to get 4A end tie done before we start the Marina 1 project. Probably going to report on the Marina 1 project next month or the month after. We're working out the schedule right now, so we'll give you an update on all those.
Thank you.
Okay, and I just want to put a period on the floating hotels. I know that Mr. Croman, again, you've been very good to accommodate the people that you've found with this, and I realize that you've reached out many different ways through dock lines, through other ways, and I know numerous people access this show, and I perhaps use this as our forum to let people know that is, when they signed their slip permittee paperwork, that this is not appropriate and not in the rule book. So perhaps a cautionary tale for anybody in the future. Okay, with that, I'm done. Carl, real quick, the October meeting is when?
October 23rd.
Thank you. With that, if there's nothing else, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
A second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.